Hello. Normally I do a short lecture on, or at least explanation of the different sections. For the method section, it was sort of, we experienced it and jumped right into it, but I did give you guys a presentation slash lecture of the introduction section. And now I need to introduce you to the other two main sections of a research study. The results section, I will provide this document for you and give you the recording to go over it. And this will be followed sometime shortly, today or tomorrow, maybe, by an exercise to do for next week. So in the introduction section, we had the inverted triangle where you went from really general to really specific, finishing up with your 3 hypotheses, which we will talk about coming up with your seed articles. And the method section was the what you did, what materials we used, how we ran the experiment from a step-by-step process and everything that was involved in it. For the results section, we are going to talk about, based on our predictions and based on the statistical analyses that we used, did we actually get what we expected to get? Were our results significant or not? And what does that tell us? So, without further ado, here's the results section. Oops, as I went too far by pushing a button. So, the results section, let's see if I can zoom a little bit on here. That's probably a good idea. Content of the results section. The primary function of the results section is to tell the reader exactly what your study found. When it is written clearly, it allows others to evaluate your results independently of your own interpretations, whether it's statistically significant or not. But why you got what you did is not part of this section. You present your interpretations in the discussion section, which we will talk about in a week or so. The results section summarizes the data you've collected, and it talks about your statistical treatment of that data and the outcomes of those analyses. The results and analyses performed must be presented in sufficient detail to support your conclusions. If you predicted what you got, then the numbers or the p-values and the statistics will back that up, that there really was a true difference between your groups. In this case, even if you don't get significant results, they all have to be reported. You just don't have to do anything more if there wasn't a significant result. So all relevant results must be reported, including those that do not support your original hypotheses. So if you don't get you predicted a main effect and you don't get one, or you get the opposite effect, we don't look at the raw scores or individual scores. We only look at the group data to see if there was a significant difference or not. Unless you're writing a combined results and discussion section, which we don't do in this class, you will not discuss any implications of your findings in this section. That is what the discussion section is for. So we follow the APA guidelines of using a separate discussion section. So this idea or admonition not to discuss the implications of your findings, whoops, got to go back up again. Sorry about that. The implications of your findings in the results section is sometimes a bit confusing. It does not mean you can't verbally describe what your findings mean. When we talk about the direction of the effect, we also want to know which group scored higher or lower than the others if we are making comparisons. So it doesn't mean that you can't verbally describe what your findings mean or explain why a particular comparison was made. Why did we compare those with and without studying? In fact, verbal descriptions are actually necessary for readers to understand and comprehend the results section. But what this caution means is that you're not going to launch into lengthy discussions of your findings in terms of relationship to previous research, to your theories, or their implications for future research. That's all done in the next section, which is called the discussion section. Discussing these types of implications is reserved for that separate discussion section. So how do we organize a results section? Well, in general, you present your findings in the order of their importance, and I am going to give you an example of a results section that we will work on sort of together, mostly me, but you'll get that from the stuff I give you. So if you if you find that you have some significant effects, like let's say you have, again, in a 2x2 type of factorial design, you will have two main effects, which is the two levels of IV1, that there's a difference and one is higher or lower than the other. There is a main effect for IV2 in which one is higher or lower than another. And you have the interaction, which we went over in chapter 12, which may or may not be significant. So let's say that you only got one main effect and you got an interaction. You would probably want to report the results of the main effect that's significant first, then maybe the main effect that's not, and then end with your interaction. Or maybe if only an interaction was significant, you start with that, and then you say that neither of your main effects were significant. But usually you want to start off with having whatever results are significant first, right? Or relevant to the primary hypothesis, at least. So if you had one primary and two secondary hypotheses, you would present the results of the primary one first. We are going to have two main effects in an interaction. If there is a main effect that is significant, that one would be talked about before the one that's not significant. So yeah, you can also stick to the order of main effect, interaction. And even if your interaction is the only significant one, you can just talk about it last because it goes after the main effects. So what about figures and tables? In this case, we will be using one figure for our graph. I think I'm going to make the data pretty much all the same depending on how you manipulate your experiment, but the graphs are going to be the same. So tables and or figures can be helpful in making clear to the reader what you found and what can be concluded from your findings. Again, we've been using graphs as our example. Yes, we've been using tables as well, but for this, we don't really need tables. And even if you were, especially if you were running the experiments in class, we wouldn't need tables. So this says which you use is largely up to you in your own study. Tables are the ones that give the exact values, but the exact value of data points presented in a figure can't usually be determined unless you draw it out. And it's kind of redundant to have both, right? Unless it calls for it. Figures are usually harder to prepare and more expensive to publish, but we're not worrying about paying a publisher. But on the other hand, when you use a figure or a graph, they are more dramatic and they illustrate trends, relationships. And remember in chapter 12, we practiced that you can actually see if there's an interaction based on the graphs. So that's much more clear. Again, this is why we opt to use a graph instead of a table. Whichever you choose, they must be labeled with the regular Arabic number. So they would either be labeled figure 1, figure 2, table 1, table 2. And in a study, a lot of times we have more than one. For your final paper, we're only going to require one figure. So you must refer to each in the text, and you must verbally describe what results are being displayed. For example, you might write, figure 1 shows the average proportion of words that were recalled correctly or correctly recalled for each type of categorized list. And that way you're giving a description. Also, you're going to tell the reader what to notice in that figure or table and point their attention to it. Thus, continuing with this same example, you might write something like, as can be seen in figure 1, it appears that recall steadily improved as the number of different categories represented in the list increased. So you're showing the trend of what the data is telling them and giving them a sort of short description of it. That way they don't have to decipher it all on their own. You must then go on to report the outcomes of the statistical tests that you performed on the data summarized in your table or figure. For example, with respect to hypothetical figure 1, you would then report the outcome of whatever statistical analysis you had performed in order to test the apparent increase in recall performance was, in fact, real, aka statistically significant. Remember, as an author, you want to take full advantage of your figures and tables to convey your findings to the reader. It takes some time to make a figure or table, so don't waste that time by not directing the reader's attention to the appropriate figure or table as soon as you begin talking about the results they present. or by not telling the reader what should be seen in the figure or table. Do not, for example, go on and on for several sentences just talking about your findings, and then at the end of the paragraph just simply say, oh yeah, see figure 1 for that, whatever, right? You're blowing it off, and it's unnecessary, and I don't want you to lose points. My whole point in this is to get you as many points as possible. We're actually going to use this homework assignment from this results section to outline as a template for your graph. So keep in mind that the readers will find it easier to understand the results you obtained if they can be looking at a figure or table of them along with your verbal description of them. It just makes things easier. So how do we present the statistics? Well, statistical analyses are, that have been performed and their outcomes must be presented in a sentence form. So this is not like the method section where you were able to list bullet points. You're going to get marked off for that, so please don't. The verbal description should make clear the type of measures used, so what type of statistical tests, the type of tests performed, and what measures are being compared in the analysis. If we are only looking at one IV and comparing two groups, like we did with the Stroop task, we would use a t-test, because a t-test compares two groups. Of course, what we are doing here in our final paper is a factorial design with 4 groups, 2 levels of one IV and 2 levels of the other IV. So any test that is looking at 3 or more groups is going to be an analysis of variance, or what we call in statistics an ANOVA. If you only have one independent variable and you have 3 or more levels, so if we think about day 1, day 4 in the same context, day 4 in a new context, whatever it is, only on one level, driving performance, then you would just have a what we call a one-way ANOVA, because you only have one IV. For us, in this final paper, we're going to have remember, a 2x2 design. So that's 2 IVs with the first IV 2 variables or 2 levels, and the second IV 2 levels, which means we are going to perform what we call a 2-way ANOVA. And there is a difference in the calculation between a within subject and a between subject ANOVA. So you're going to see in the homework example that I'm going to provide that it is a within subject presentation. So the type of statistical presentation for that design is a 2-way within subjects ANOVA. If each group only did 1, it would be a 2-way between subjects ANOVA. But 2-way means factorial. It means 2 IVs. If we had 3 IVs, 3-way, blah, 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 blah. So when you report descriptive statistics, such as means, which we are using mean comparisons, right? Marginal means for the main effects and simple means, and yeah, you get it. So when you report descriptive statistics such as means, you also need to report the appropriate measure of variability. So standard deviations, variances, or mean square errors, which you are going to include, and I will go over that when we do that for the assignment. When you report inferential statistics, or the outcome of an analysis, that's your t-test, f-test, right? R value, you must include the symbol for the statistic involved, in this case an F value, degrees of freedom, the value, which is the actual number of the F statistic, and your probability level, which includes the p-value. If it's significant, it's going to be less than 0.05. So this is the way to properly report outcomes in a statistical test within the text. And here we see, as predicted, right? So it was hypothesized that the average score for 7th grade girls would be greater for members of the opposite sex than the same sex. So they would say, you know, in the introduction, we predicted that 7th grade girls would have a significantly greater liking for members of the opposite sex than boys do. So that was the prediction, and as predicted, the average score for 7th grade girls reflected a significantly greater liking for members of the opposite sex. Here we have a mean, that's your M, of 5.76 and a standard deviation of 0.85. Then did the average score for 7th grade boys. M, mean is 2.43, standard deviation is 1.22. Now, because there was only 2 groups being compared, your statistic is a t-test and not an f-test. So here's your t-value with a degrees of freedom of 58. Your actual t-value statistic is 3.82. And then your p-value is going to be less than 0.01. So there was a significant difference. Here, we also want to see the numbers. So proportions of words recalled correctly were 0.67, 0.75, and 0.86 for the immediate, short, and long spacing intervals, respectively. The one-way within subjects ANOVA, so there's the name of the test, performed on these data revealed there was a significant main effect or a main effect of spacing, interval to be significant. You can also say significant main effect. Here is your F statistic, which is going to give you 2 different degrees of freedoms, 2 and 58, number of groups, number of subjects, in case you forgot from Psych 91 or Math 227. Mean square error, remember that this is MSE stands for mean square error, and that is 0.45. Your p-value, again, is less than 0.01, which shows that these numbers were significantly different from one another, or at least 0.86 and 0.67 were significantly different. When you have more than 2 groups, what an ANOVA tells you is there is a difference. It doesn't always tell you where the difference is. It doesn't tell you if there's a difference between all 3 or all 4. It just tells you there's a difference between at least 2 different numbers. So when you are typing this, the results section begins immediately after the end of the method section and has a centered heading, just like we did for the method section. So right after the introduction started, even if it's not at the bottom of a page, right? You put method in bold right underneath introduction. Results is going to go right after the method section. And when we get to discussion, it's going to be right after the results, as if it's all one portion. So it begins immediately after the end of the method section and has the centered heading results. Tables and figures, although when you read an article, you see that the actual tables and figures are in the results section. This is done after it's been edited. So when you turn in a manuscript, which is the form that we are going to turn in, you guys are going to turn in to me, the graph of figure 1 is going to be described in the results section right after the method, right before the discussion, but the actual graph itself is going in the very, very back of the document after even the references. So just remember that, and I will keep reminding you as we go through. Tables and figures are constructed separately. Each table or figure would be on its own page and placed after the reference section, like I just said. You have to make sure that the tables have significant titles and the figures have captions. We will go over those things before you turn in your final paper. Any additional information about tables, figures, titles, figure captions can of course be found in the APA manual and numerous examples. You can find those online, or if you actually have the manual, APA manual, then you can look through it and see. So I will put this up today, which is Friday, and either later tonight or tomorrow or something like that, I will put up the assignment, which will be due in a week. So have a great rest of your day. It's actually office hours for me in 3 minutes, so we'll see if anybody shows up. But have a great rest of your day. If not, I'll talk to you guys soon.